in my book, Mystery of the Olmecs, there's a lot of pictures of these guys, and they're really strange looking.
Are they from this planet?
Well, boy, when you see some of these guys, and they're heavy, elongated heads, I mean, for whatever reason, they have either bound the heads as babies, or else they naturally look like this, but their cranial capacity is like double that of a normal human.
Yeah.
And people look like this all over the world. Akhenaten and Nefertiti, Egyptians did this as well. Tutankhamun himself was also what we'd call a cone head binding. Then the dolicephalus is the technical term for that, where you have an elongated cranium. I have a whole chapter in Mystery of the Olmecs about this, and the more you look into this whole thing of head binding, of shaping these long, cone-head craniums, the weirder that gets. Because
I'm not sure that they made these. These look like they're genetic mutations, or they came from someplace else.
When you see them, they look like aliens, and so that's been I think a natural assumption, because when you see some of these skulls and the figurines and things like that come out of Mexico, also South America, yes, you're right. I mean, they look like they're extraterrestrials. I mean,
look at the size of the eye sockets, David. They're huge.
Well, that's right. And I mean, these are not the kind of guys you're going to want to meet in a dark alley. I mean, they look like something out of like these alien movies or something like that. And in fact, that Swiss artist Geiger, who created that kind of look of these long-headed, sort of insectoid aliens in that movie. But that is what these guys look like. And when you show photos of just your typical Olmecs, they're some weird-looking guys. I mean, you can hardly believe it.
Are you familiar with Lloyd Pye's work in The Star Child?
Yes, I am. And
very similar skull.
Well, right, and his skull, and I've been privileged to examine the Star Child skull myself. I've met Lloyd a couple of times, and that is a really unusual skull. And that's the kind of thing we're talking about, where you have these really strange skulls. Some are smashed sideways, kind of like his Star Child skull is like that. And there are, you will see particularly in Mexico and in Peru, you will see in museums some of these skulls, and some are really shocking to see. They're just so bizarre. We don't know why people did that. Now, it may be that some of these people really were extraterrestrials. That's just how they naturally looked. We know that, at least in some cases, the Olmecs and the Mayans and people all over the world, in fact, were doing this, including the Kurds in northern Iraq, the Egyptians in Malta, they were doing this. People were, somehow, they would shape young babies' skulls like this, at least in some cases. When you are still an infant, you have plates in your head, and they haven't fused yet. They're to allow your head to grow bigger, but eventually as an adult, the plates in your head do fuse together. Prior to that, you can work with the head. And we know that in some cases people did this.
But can you make it that large? And what about the eye sockets? How do you make your eye sockets twice as big as a normal human?
Well, that's a good question. With the deformation of these skulls, I mean, it would deform the eye sockets too, and even it would have been a problem in some cases, you would think, for that their heads would have become so heavy, and the back of their heads are extended like twice as far as ours. I mean, it's pretty obvious when you see these weird skulls like this, that would have been even hard for them just to hold their heads up. If you look at statues of Nefertiti, of Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, their daughters, Meritaten and Meketaten, they also have these really weird, elongated skulls. I mean, maybe they were extraterrestrials too, and that has been suggested, of course. But But there are ways. I mean, maybe they were trying to copy these extraterrestrials, or they were...
Right, that's possible.
Right. Some of these people probably were humans.
Or maybe hybrids?
Hybrids, right. And, even... and I know Zacharias Sitchin, too, and I'm familiar with his work. It's quite interesting. I do disagree with him on a number of things. But, the idea that these Anunnaki, some aliens are here, also that they look like this, extraterrestrials don't necessarily look a whole lot different than we are. And in fact, perhaps, we are extraterrestrials too, in that sense. But with these elongated skulls, this was really a hallmark of the Olmecs. And also a special frown that they had. There were certain looks. There was a V cleft also in their heads, like they actually had, at least they depicted this kind of a cleft right at the top of their head. The Olmecs did all kinds of weird stuff, including tattooing, piercing. They had mohawk haircuts. A lot of the weird stuff that we do today, they were doing back then. And it kind of shows you, there's nothing new under the sun. But a lot of these weird Olmec characters, except for the really elongated heads, I mean, they would almost look like a modern guy walking down the streets of Los Angeles or something.
Hey, David, when we come back, let's talk about the kind of technology that they might have had. And also, you've done some work on lost cities. What about Atlantis? I got to talk with you about that, too. We'll be back in a moment. David Hatcher-Childress, our guest on Coast to Coast AM. And our special guest, David Hatcher-Childress. Next hour, we'll open up the phone lines. But I've got more to talk with him about when we come right back on Coast to Coast AM. David, can we speculate on what kind of technology the Olmecs had? What do you think?
Well, yes. One of the strange things that the Olmecs did was carve these giant heads out of basalt, and they weighed 20 tons. The basalt is extremely difficult rock to carve. It's so hard. So you have to look into that. The whole thing of moving giant megalithic blocks around, the Olmecs did that. Mexico does have megalithic cities, such as Monte Alban and Mitla, also La Venta, the center of the Olmecs. So one of the things that we look at, and say with the Olmecs, with the Egyptians, ancient India, Atlantis, and whatnot, is what ancient people are able to do. And if you are able to quarry a 100-ton block of granite or basalt, move that 20 miles, stack it up in a giant wall, places like Baalbek, Peru, Mexico, certain Pacific islands. You're in Egypt, of course. What you're doing is something that even modern construction companies wouldn't do today. It's kind of the way we look at the past. And this was in my book, Technology of the Gods. This was the subject I tackled was, okay, we perceive ancient civilizations as being primitive. The way that modern historians paint the past to us is, 8,000 years ago, people were cavemen, very primitive. Then suddenly they just stepped out of their caves, started building ziggurats and pyramids and things like that. And lo and behold, here we are, modern man with all of this cool stuff that we have. But really, the ancient civilizations weren't like that. There's a roller coaster of ups and downs. That's what the graph of history would read. We would have times of enlightenment and science, these golden ages of legends. But then there have been crashes, and this happened with the Olmecs too, where suddenly these guys are moving giant heads around, they're carving huge statues, then moving giant blocks around. You see this, say, in Peru, and then suddenly it all just stopped. Some cataclysm just halted all the workers. They left huge blocks the size of a semi-truck just lying on roads and things like that. They were never made it to the giant